Science fiction in the cinema often turns round to be, the fictional or fictive science of the cinema itself, the future feats it may achieve scanned in line with the technical feat that conceives them right now and before our eyes. I love this sentence from my colleague Garrett Stewart, who also happens to be one of the most superb prose stylists I know. This is not so surprising when we learn that a much younger Garrett Stewart collaborated with Virginia Tufte on her first two books, Grammar as Style and Grammar as Style Exercises in Creativity. Indeed, many of the sentence examples I've drawn from Tufte's third book, Artful Sentences, Syntax as Style, were originally brought to her attention by Garrett Stewart. Garrett's often cited sentence about science fiction film appears in his essay, The Videology of Science Fiction. And it would not be inaccurate to say that this single sentence was the inspiration for an entire book I wrote about science fiction film. I love the sentence because it succinctly captures a crucial truth about the relationship of the subject matter of SF film to the production technologies that make that subject matter come alive on the screen. The amazing technologies that allow us to make science fiction films every bit as interesting, if not more so, than the stories about technology those films tell. I also love the sentence, and I couldn't get it out of my mind once I read it, because of its masterful exploitation of balanced form. With that somewhat gratuitous but marvelous sounding turns round to be that follows the initial turns out to be, Garrett signals the reader that this sentence will do more than present propositional content. Indeed, it paves the way for a cascade of balances. Science fiction in the cinema is soon balanced against the fictional or fictive science of the cinema itself. And that pairing of fictional or fictive intensifies even further the sentence's commitment to balance. Future feats that the cinema may depict are balanced by the technical feat that conceives them. And the time, right now, is balanced by the place before our eyes. While this sentence gives voice to a stunning critical insight, that insight is made more powerful, indeed unforgettable, by a voice that insistently draws authority from the duple rhythms of balanced form. Garrett's sentence may lack some of the dramatic force of Conrad's. She was savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress. But my great appreciation for that wonderfully balanced sentence from Conrad owes more than a little to another of Garrett's brilliant essays, this one on the significance of Marlowe's lie in Conrad's masterpiece. It is tellingly titled with balanced brio, Lying as Dying in Heart of Darkness. But I'll defer the brief for a Garrett Stewart fan club until another day. Right now, I want to get back to the consideration of balance I started in the last lecture. As I've noted, balance and parallelism are often discussed as if they were interchangeable terms, and in a sense they are. However, I'm going to reserve parallelism to describe similarities that are maintained in prose beyond the duple sound and sense of balance, which focuses our eyes and our ears on pairs of things. My reasons for trying to maintain this distinction will, I hope, become more evident in a future lecture when I consider serial constructions, generally identified by their division of the world into threes, but sometimes extending parallel constructions to catalogs of 4 or even more terms. For now, I want to discuss balance first as a formal syntax, a formal sentence syntax, and then as a form or rhythm that can appear within or among sentences whenever there is some pairing, whether of sound, of vowels and consonants, of words of the same length or syllable count, phrases of the same construction, words or phrases linked by conjunctions, concepts that are similar or antithetical, or any use of language that foregrounds two of anything. Balanced form can range from the obvious syntactic pairing of chiasmus, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, to more subtle oppositional pairing, against the iceberg of her smile, I sail the Titanic of my hopes. As I previously specified, a balanced sentence hinges in the middle, usually split by a semicolon, the second half of the sentence paralleling the first half, but changing one or two keywords or altering word order. In this sense, the second half of the sentence can be thought of as a kind of mirror image of the first half, the reflection reversing the original image. One of the best-known examples of the balanced sentence comes from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy, or his speechwriters, had an ear for parallelism as well as for balance, as we can see in another, less memorable but equally well-crafted excerpt from his inaugural address. All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. And Winston Churchill would certainly have to be acknowledged a modern master of balance. I previously mentioned his classically balanced dismissal of socialism. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. A more effective way of stressing his point is hard to imagine, since his balanced sentence also gains emphasis from the fact that it is highly suspensive, delaying completion of his message until the final word of the sentence. But Churchill was also fond of smaller balanced forms, particularly when speaking of language. Short words are best, and the old words, when short, are best of all, he said. He liked to pair words. Writing a long and substantial book is like having a friend and companion at your side to whom you can always turn for comfort and amusement, and whose society becomes more attractive as a new and widening field of interest is lighted in the mind. And his speeches are peppered with prefab balanced pairings such as black and blue, brass and bluff, facts and figures, forgive and forget, hemmed and hawed, by hook or crook, life and limb, live and learn, rough and ready, part and parcel, thick and thin, wear and tear, and so on. Balanced sentences really call attention to themselves, and they stick in the mind, drawing their power from the tension set up between repetition and variation. Since the real power of the balanced sentence comes only at its end, it can be thought of as another form of periodic sentence, perhaps the most intense form. In an odd way, the balanced sentence also works generatively or heuristically, as does the cumulative. Since you can set the balance in motion without really knowing where you want the sentence to go. For instance, given an informal definition, those who talk when you wish them to listen are bores, you can insert a semicolon, switch terms, those who listen when you wish them to talk are, and you can choose almost any word to fill in that final blank. Indeed, this fill-in-the-blank phenomenon suggests that the form of the balanced sentence may be more memorable than the meaning conveyed by and through that form, like having a humongous stretch limo drive up and deliver a perfectly nondescript rider. I can only remember the balance of Barry Goldwater's infamous battle cry of 1964, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I can always remember the balance between extremism and moderation, and between vice and virtue. But for the life of me, I can never remember that this sentence balanced liberty against justice, two terms usually paired, as in, with liberty and justice for all. While the most rhetorically polished balanced sentences do tend to be divided by a semicolon, the balanced sentence does not demand a semicolon, as in the case I previously mentioned with the chiasmic, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Another example of balance without the semicolon would be Fitzgerald's, "There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired." Apart from its aphoristic nature, and anyone who wants to start a bumper sticker business had better know how to construct balances, the balanced sentence offers an obvious advantage to any writer who must compare two subjects. Such a comparison can be made by treating first one subject and then the other, through splitting the comparison into two halves, each half focusing on one of the subjects, or by alternating paragraphs, each paragraph focusing on one of the subjects, or it can be made sentence by sentence with each balanced sentence matching the two subjects on a point-by-point basis. This kind of comparison or contrast can really profit from the use of balanced sentences. Balance is the specific syntactic tool ready-made for comparisons. Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson, is probably the greatest master of the balanced form, as we can see in his comparison of Dryden with Pope. Pope had perhaps the judgment of Dryden, but Dryden certainly wanted the diligence of Pope. In acquired knowledge, the superiority must be allowed to Dryden, whose education was more scholastic and who, before he became an author, had been allowed more time for study with better means of information. His mind has a larger range, and he collects his images and illustrations from a more extensive circumference of science. Dryden knew more of man and his general nature, and Pope in his local manners. There is more dignity in the knowledge of Dryden and more certainty in that of Pope. The style of Dryden is capricious and varied. That of Pope is cautious and uniform. Dryden obeys the motions of his own mind. Pope constrains his mind to his own rules of composition. Dryden is sometimes vehement and rapid. Pope is always smooth, uniform, and gentle. Dryden's page is a natural field rising into inequalities and diversified by the varied exuberance of abundant vegetation. Pope's is a velvet lawn shaven by the scythe and leveled by the roller. Of genius, that power which constitutes a poet, that quality without which judgment is cold and knowledge is inert, that energy which collects, combines, amplifies, and animates, the superiority must, with some hesitation, be allowed to Dryden. Dryden's performances were always hasty, either excited by some external occasion or extorted by domestic necessity. He composed without consideration and published without correction. What his mind could supply at call or gather in one excursion was all that he sought and all that he gave. The dilatory caution of Pope enabled him to condense his sentiments, to multiply his images, and to accumulate all that study might produce or chance might supply. If the flights of Dryden therefore are higher, Pope continues longer on the wing. If of Dryden's fire the blaze is brighter, of Pope's the heat is more regular and constant. Dryden often surpasses expectation, and Pope never falls below it. Dryden is read with frequent astonishment, and Pope with perpetual delight. Even if you read the above passage so quickly that you don't get much of its meaning, you'll notice that it has a distinct rhythm or cadence. It sounds balanced, alternating between similar sounds or beats as well as between Pope and Dryden. And remember that a balanced view of things is a comment on fairness and even-handedness, a mental trait to be desired and valorized as well as a form or a syntax. Johnson's comparison, then, displays a second kind or degree of balance, that of smaller forms within the sentence and of those forms between and among sentences. Any time that a sentence, part of a sentence, or groups of sentences makes us aware of pairs of things, whether objects, sounds, words, syntactic structures, that reveals some degree of balanced form. This kind of balance can take almost any shape or form, can appear at almost any time. It may come from the insinuating insistence of alliteration, assonance, or consonants, or from the pronounced parallelism of phrases and modifiers, metaphors, and the larger syntax of the sentence. Balance may even come from a conceptual dualism, a thought that focuses our thinking inexorably on two subjects, entities, ideas, images, as in, she starved so that he could eat, or in Shelley's aphorism, imagination means individuation. Dr. Johnson's comparisons of the two poets contains almost all of these forms of balance. And here, with Dr. Johnson, is the second place, John Lilly's example being the first, where balance fell at least a bit into disrepute. Before we consider some of Johnson's detractors, however, let's look at a few more examples of the prose style with which he is so closely associated. This from his preface to a dictionary of the English language. Among these unhappy mortals is the writer of dictionaries, whom mankind have considered not as the pupil, but the slave of science, the pioneer of literature, doomed only to remove rubbish and clear obstructions from the paths of learning and genius, who press forward to conquest and glory without bestowing a smile on the humble drudge that facilitates their progress. Every other author may aspire to praise. The lexicographer can only hope to escape reproach, and even this negative recompense has been yet granted to very few. When I took the first survey of my undertaking, I found our speech copious without order and energetic without rules. Wherever I turned my view, there was perplexity to be disentangled and confusion to be regulated. Choice was to be made out of boundless variety without any established principle of selection. Adulterations were to be detected without a settled test of purity, and modes of expression to be rejected or received without the suffrages of any writers of classical reputation or acknowledged authority. The question we aspiring students of the sentence must answer for ourselves before we decide whether in-your-face balance will be a feature of our own syntactic arsenal is simply this: does Dr. Johnson's prose strike us as impressive or obsessive, well-crafted to positive affect, or overdone to the point of putting readers off? And of course, what we're really doing here is trying to decide what we feel about balance than about Dr. Johnson. The problem with balance, as is the problem with any syntax pushed too hard, is that it levels reality, forcing everything into binary agreement or opposition. In an essay on Johnson's parallelism, W.K. Wimsatt Jr. has outlined the case against balance, citing Hazlitt's criticism of Johnson's style. All his periods are cast in the same mold, are of the same size and shape, and consequently have little fitness to the variety of things he professes to treat of. Wimsatt observes that Johnson runs the risk of preferring the meaning of parallel to a more relevant meaning of variety. He explains in his characteristically abstract but balanced fashion, a writer may insist by explicit or implicit means on the equality or on the opposite, the difference of the members within their frame of equality, or on the opposite, the difference of the members within their frame of equality or parallel. He may exploit one kind of meaning or the other. If he recurrently gives to his multiplied phrases or clauses a turn toward equality, then the relations of member to member, of premise to premise, and to conclusion will be strengthened and plain. The whole sequence of meaning will have a high degree of coherence and regularity, but this will be at the expense of modulation, of individuality of premise, of variety. Hazlitt advances much the same critique of pronounced balanced form, using Edmund Burke as his target. The words are not fitted to the things, but the things to the words. Everything is seen through a false medium. It is putting a mask on the face of nature which may indeed hide some specks and blemishes, but takes away all beauty, delicacy, and variety. And if you think that sounds like a serious indictment, wait until you hear Macaulay's critique of Dr. Johnson. In his review of Boswell's Life of Johnson, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who it should be remembered was himself known for his use of balanced form, accused Johnson of writing in Johnsonese, a style which he called systematically vicious and famously opined. His constant practice of padding out a sentence with useless epithets till it became as stiff as the bust of an exquisite, his antithetical forms of expression constantly employed even where there is no opposition in the ideas expressed, his big words wasted on little things, his harsh inversions so widely different from those graceful and easy inversions which give variety, spirit, and sweetness to the expression of our great old writers. All these peculiarities have been imitated by his admirers and parodied by his assailants till the public has become sick of the subject. Not so fast, rebutted George Saintsbury in 1916, who termed Macaulay's description of Johnson's style, quote, one of the worst parts of his essay, and then used the term tessellation to describe Johnson's rhetorical strategy in which, quote, clauses and sentences were balanced against each other and built up into larger sentences and paragraphs on a system of almost mathematical or military exactitude, file being drawn up against file and squadron against squadron, while both the constituent clause members and their constituents of substantive, adjective, and verb were balanced or dressed against each other in pairs, triplets, even quaternions of strictest equilibrium in rhythm and thought. While Saintsbury acknowledges that this Palladian architecture of style is no doubt more imposing than delectable, he insists that it is, quote, by no means omnipresent, nor is it ever very conspicuous in Johnson's really best passages. Okay, maybe that's not a rousing defense, but it is a much more accurate description of what Johnson does than Macaulay offers in his condemnation. I suspect that today we might be tempted to describe Johnson's style as fractal rather than tessellated, but both terms suggest the way that his balances contain balances which contain balances, giving his writing a balanced texture that is unmatched. What's missing so far in these discussions of balance is the fact that they are so much fun for the writer to construct and for the reader to recognize. Matthew Clark touches on this underreported aspect in his book, A Matter of Style, on Writing and Technique, where he recognizes that for modern taste, the example of sustained balance and parallelism may be excessive, but notes that there is a great vigor and pleasure in the writing. He adds, this passage must have been fun to compose, and for the reader in the right frame of mind, it's still a lot of fun to read. In this sort of style, the figure doesn't merely serve the idea, it becomes an end in itself, and ideas are sought to provide an occasion for the figure. Clark offers an excerpt from George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman as further evidence of the ludic potential of balanced form. Shaw's Don Juan is replying to the devil's charge that he has been uncivil with a delicious blowout of balance. Pooh! Why should I be civil to them or to you? In this palace of lies, a truth or two will not hurt you. Your friends are all the dullest dogs I know. They are not beautiful, they are only decorated. They are not clean, they are only shaved and starched. They are not dignified, they are only fashionably dressed. They are not moral, they are only conventional. They are not virtuous, they are only cowardly. They are not loyal, they are only servile. Not dutiful, only sheepish. Not public-spirited, only patriotic. Not courageous, only quarrelsome. Not determined, only obstinate. Not masterful, only domineering. Not self-controlled, only obtuse. Not self-respecting, only vain. Not kind, only sentimental, not social, only gregarious, not considerate, only polite, not intelligent, only opinionated, not progressive, only factious, not imaginative, only superstitious, not just, only vindictive, and not truthful at all. Liars, every one of them, to the very backbone of their souls. And in the writing of William Gass, we find an even more effective brief for the use of balance. As Gass goes for balances at every opportunity, seemingly delighting in the rhythm. America has no more innovative a prose stylist than Gass, and it is his example, not Dr. Johnson's, I follow when I champion the use of balanced forms in effective writing. In his novels such as The Tunnel, Omensetter's Luck, and Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, in his short fiction collected in the Heart of the Country, but particularly in his collections of essays on Being Blue, The World Within the Word, Fiction and the Figures of Life, The Habitations of the Word, and A Temple of Texts, Gass does more breathtaking things with sentences, gets more energy and excitement from his prose than does any other living American writer. Even wrenched from the contexts that give them so much added impact, his sentences stand as monuments to his mastery of language and to his fascination with balance. Here are just a few examples. This first from an essay on suicide. Poetry is cathartic only for the unserious, for in front of the rush of expressive need stands the barrier of form, and when the hurdler's scissored legs and outstretched arms carry him over the bars, the limp in his life, the headache in his heart, the emptiness he's full of, are as absent as his street shoes, which will pinch and scrape his feet in all the old leathery ways once the race is over and he has to walk through the front door of his future like a brushman with some feckless pattern and a chintzy plastic prize. This about Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. There's a cantina at every corner of the consul's world. Sin and innocence, guilt and salvation shape Lowry's private square of opposition. And if sanctuary and special knowledge are its gifts in one guise, and gaiety and relaxation its gifts in another, cater-corner from church and gym, or brothel and prison. This one I love, on Samuel Beckett. He writes equally well in two languages, nitty and gritty. He is a minimalist because he compresses and puts everything in by leaving most of it out. Joyce wished to rescue the world by getting it back into his book. Beckett wishes to save our souls by purging us impossibly of matter. This on Borges. Borges is a fine poet too, but he revolutionized our conception of both the story and the essay by blending and bewildering them. He will not be forgiven or forgotten for that. This about the tale of 1001 Nights. In its nearly 1,001-year journey to our time, these Arabian contes drew additions, endured omissions, submitted to revisions, suffered expurgations, were betrayed by translations, fussed over by annotations, and stuffed into editions aimed at special interests, while experiencing normal negligence and the customary incompetence of sellers, scribes, scholars, and consumers, the tattering dispersal and destruction of copies, the corruption of the text, the misunderstanding of its meaning, the exploitation of its exotic scenes and settings, as well as the decline of its importance into what's so ironic for the nights we call bedtime stories. And oh yes, in a fitting close to our consideration of balance, here's Gass on Dr. Johnson in the company of other noteworthy preface writers. In the preface to his dictionary, Dr. Johnson whines, another persistent feature of the genre, "It is the fate of those who toil at the lower employments of life to be rather driven by the fear of evil than attracted by the prospect of good, to be exposed to censure without hope of praise, to be disgraced by miscarriage, or punished for neglect where success would have been without applause and diligence without reward. A whine, yes, but how perfectly composed.